All right, so I'd like to welcome everybody back to the first talk of the afternoon session after lunch. My name is Michelle Adams, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the chair of psychology and director of the Interdisciplinary graduate program in neuroscience. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Professor Adam Zeman. He's a professor of cognitive and behavioral neurology at the University of Exeter Medical School, and today he's going to talk to us about the eyes, mind, perspectives on visual imagery.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Thank you for the invitation to this really interesting meeting. It's this beautiful place. It's very good to be here, not least because I only once previously last year was talking in Turkey, in Antalya, and because of dense fog in Amsterdam, I arrived 5 minutes after the end of my talk. So I'm very pleased to be here in time to speak. So, I suspect that everybody in this room from time to time would have wondered what is special about the human mind, about human cognition. And it seems to me that one quite strong candidate is our capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now, to recollect the past, to anticipate the future, to enter the virtual world created by an artist or by a scientist. So I like this quotation from the anthropologist Robin Dunbar: what sets us apart is a life in the mind, the ability to imagine. And on that background, I was very intrigued when this referral letter was handed to me about 15 years ago. We were due to see this gentleman following an angioplasty, so following a procedure on his heart. Following on from this, he's become aware of the fact that he's now unable to imagine anything. He noticed this particularly at night when he's never been a good sleeper. Previously, he used to imagine things to help himself get off to sleep, but now can't do so. Can't picture his children or his grandchildren. So the general practitioner, the family doctor, had never seen a case like this before, and nor had I. And I will tell you the story of this case and the line of research that it led to. So I'm going to begin by telling you about MX, this patient, and then the rest of the talk will explain itself as I run through. So let me introduce you to this patient. I hope he'll be able to tell you a little about himself.
Just a few weeks after I had my angioplasty, I noticed at night when I went to bed that I couldn't do what I usually did, which was, before going to sleep, thinking about my family, my children, my grandchildren, picturing them, and it just wouldn't come to mind. And also, I used to have a technique to go to sleep. I couldn't get to sleep, and that was to start at 99 and count backwards. But looking at the numbers, either black and white or white and black, watch them in my mind's eye, click them off, and I never got down to 1, I was asleep by then. So that was about 3 weeks after I had the angioplasty.
Did you find that all visual imagery disappeared? So were you able to visualize places which you visited, for example?
No. I couldn't visualize anything. I could remember them, but I couldn't visualize them.
And you don't think that the ability to visualize has had very much impact on your ability to remember?
As far as I can see, it hasn't had any effect at all. My memory is as good as it was, I think.
Even to remember visual details?
Yes, and that sounds a bit odd. Even to remember visual details, which I can't see, but I can remember.
You just know?
I just know, but I can't see them. I can't explain that.
So, I hope you're able to understand his Scots accent. I hadn't encountered a patient who'd become unable to visualize before. So I went to the literature and discovered that there were indeed some cases of this general kind. Perhaps the first was described by the famous French neurologist Charcot in the 1880s. He encountered a patient, a rather articulate patient, who had abruptly lost the ability to visualize, and in association with that loss, he found that he had difficulty in recognizing faces, that's prosopagnosia. He had difficulty in recognizing familiar places, topographical agnosia, and he found his visual memory had deteriorated. His dreams became avisual. He kept a diary and he gave a rather nice description of the change in his experience. He said, if you were to ask me to represent the towers of Notre Dame, a browsing sheep or a ship in distress, I should have to reply to you that although I know perfectly well how to distinguish these objects, and perfectly well know all about them, they have for me no meaning at all as regards mental vision. And then in the 1980s, American psychologist Martha Farrer pulled together the 50 or so cases that were by name in the literature, and she tried to make sense of them in terms of a quite intuitive model of visualization developed by Stephen Koslin. So the idea here is that when you look at things, you encode information through your eyes into the visual buffer, essentially the visual cortices, and then you can do a number of things with that information, but most commonly we match what we are looking at against engrams in our long-term visual memory, enabling us to recognize things. And then if we want to visualize something, we activate information in long-term visual memory, and according to this theory, use it to generate activity in the visual buffer, which gives us a visual image which has a visual field. For most of us, it's a little bit like seeing, they're not quite the same. And she was able to classify the cases of acquired loss of visualization into 3 groups. So there were patients who had damaged long-term visual memory. They lost the ability to visualize, but they could also no longer recognize. They had an agnosia. And there was a second group who had a rather lower level inspection deficit, which affected both visualization and perception. And then there was a third group who could recognize perfectly normally, but could no longer visualize. They had what she called a visual imagery generation deficit. And then following Farrer's work, of course, there's been quite a bit of work in functional imaging to find out what happens in the brain when you visualize. Now, I guess everyone in this room is familiar with functional brain imaging, but just in case there are 1 or 2 who are not, the principle is really very simple. When you use your brain, it's a bit like muscle. Blood flow increases to regions of brain which you're using particularly intensely, and there are a number of techniques for making that increase in blood flow visible. Here you see areas which are particularly active when you are looking at faces, including the fusiform face area. If you damage the fusiform face area, you cause prosopagnosia, difficulty in recognizing faces. When you visualize a face, you activate the same regions, but more weakly. So visualization is a kind of weak echo of perception in this sense. But of course, when you decide to visualize an apple or your front door or a face, you are making a decision to do something. So you would expect that you'd activate areas of the brain that are involved in cognitive control, executive areas. And indeed, the brain imaging studies show that frontoparietal regions, which are associated with cognitive control, tend to be activated in visualization tasks. So on that background, let's come back to MX. He gave this very articulate account of the change in his experience. He could no longer visualize faces and places. He dropped off to sleep. He said that when he read a novel, he previously had entered a visual world. That was no longer the case. His dreams became avisual, just as in the case of Charcot's patient. He said that if he put his keys down somewhere previously, he might have been able to visualize where they were. He could no longer do that. My monitor has failed. When I try to visualize, I experience a complete blank. Perception was fine, and he still enjoyed painting. He was otherwise generally well. He had an essentially normal structural MRI scan. In most areas of neuropsychology, he performed normally, but of course, on measures of subjective imagery, he performed at floor. I should have shown this to you, but I'll explain it to you. There is a test called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, which is a very intuitive measure of the vividness of imagery. It invites you, for example, to visualize the sun setting in a misty sky, and then to rate the vividness of your image from no image at all, just thinking about it, which gives you a score of 1 over 5, to imagery as vivid as real seeing, which gives you a score of 5 over 5. He was scoring at 16 over 80 at floor. But he performed well on what are meant to be tests of visual imagery, which was curious. So, for example, if I ask you to tell me which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree, many of you will find yourself making a kind of mental comparison of the 2 shades to come up with the answer. And X did fine on tests like this, and when we asked him how he arrived at the answer, he said, well, I just know. I can't see anything, I just know, and that seemed plausible. So he went on to perform a functional imaging study, which I'll show you, and we described him in terms of blind imagination. So this was by analogy with blind sight. Patients with blind sight have damage to visual cortex and can't see on the opposite side of visual space. They have no visual experience, but nevertheless it turns out that some of them can make accurate guesses about visual events in their blind field. So they have visual function without visual experience. And in a sense, MX had imaginative function without imaginative experience. And because we were puzzled by this and thought a functional imaging study might shed some further light. So, we essentially asked him to look at famous spaces and places and then to visualize them, and we looked at what happened in his brain when he did so. Here's what happens when he looks at them. He was a very good activator. He's activating those occipitotemporal areas which you or I would activate when you looked at a face, and he did so just as well as controls. So there was no difference with controls when he looked. But when he attempted to imagine, these bright colors are now showing you areas of reduced activation, so he hypo-activated those occipitotemporal areas. He failed to activate his visual cortices as strong as controls, and he hyper-activated some areas at the front of the brain. So here was a nice neural correlate for his loss of visualization. And I thought that the story might end there, but our case description got picked up by Carl Zeman, an American science journalist in Discover magazine, which I think is a popular science journal in the States. And then over the course of the next few years, I was contacted by about 20 people who said, you know, I'm just like this guy NX, but I'm always happy. I've never been able to see anything in my mind's eye, and I've always realized this is something a little bit odd about me, but it's been hard to describe to others. And we sent these people the Vividness questionnaire and also another kind of common sense questionnaire asking them a range of questions. They all scored, as you'd expect, low on the Vividness questionnaire. This is the kind of score you'd obtain in this room or from a group of undergraduates in Exeter in this case. And these people told a reasonably consistent story. We decided that this phenomenon needed a name, because there were some terms in the literature, but they were very unwieldy. Things like defective revisualization, visual irreminiscence, not very catchy. So I consulted a classicist friend who said, well, why don't you borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, which was phantasia and taganeion at the end. So this is a neuropsychological term borrowed from philosophy in terms of, say, phantasia. And as I say, these folk told a reasonably consistent story. They tended to discover that they were a little bit different in their teens or 20s, often when they would be with friends or family who were reminiscing, and they would realize that the other people seemed to be having an experience that was a little bit visual, and they really weren't. It didn't have a huge emotional impact on most of them. They found it interesting, curious, rather than devastating. Half of them said, I don't have a mind's eye, but I've got a perfectly good mind's ear. I can hear a tune in my head. Half of them said, I don't know what it would be like to imagine in any sense modality. So there was a variability there. Interestingly, most of them said, oh yeah, I dream in images, I just don't see them during the day. So there was a dissociation between dream imagery and wakeful imagery. 2/3 of them said they had rather poor autobiographical memory by comparison with their friends and family. They attributed to themselves verbal, analytical, and mathematical strengths, but then they were all readers of Discover magazine, so they were a rather biased sample. And then we included a question in which we asked them to count the number of windows in their house or apartment. And they gave really interesting answers, or descriptions of how they did this. They could all do it and come up with an accurate answer. But they said they did it by some kind of avisual means. 5 windows, I remember them, but I don't see them. My thought is intentional and object-orientated. I sort of fly through the house and inspect every room if the idea of a window is present. It's not an image, it's more like understanding. I know it's there. So we thought this was interesting and asked ourselves whether we were the first people to come across this phenomenon of lifelong aphantasia. And of course, when you think you've discovered something new, you are always wrong. In fact, this was described first by Francis Galton, who was a Victorian psychologist in the UK. He was probably the first psychologist to devise quantitative questionnaires to get at mental experience. He devised a beautiful questionnaire called the breakfast table questionnaire. So this is very evocative of Victorian Britain. It says, imagine your breakfast table as you left it this morning, and then you have to visualize the objects lying upon it, the silver salt cellar and so on. He noticed that there were some participants whose power of visualization was 0, as he put it. But really, very little attention has been paid to this phenomenon by psychologists since. But other interesting things did happen in the 1880s. So Cotard was a French psychiatrist who described Cotard's syndrome, which probably some of you have come across, which is the bizarre delusion that you no longer exist, or that you have died. It's a self-contradictory delusion. And Cotard believed that the loss of the mind's eye was an important element in forming this delusion. And I've already mentioned Charcot, who described a case of loss of the mind's eye. So in the 1880s, there was this topic was current, but it then rather dropped out of view. An American psychologist, Bill Ford, who himself lacks visual imagery, gave a survey to a large number of students and came up with a figure for about 2% for loss for lifelong aphantasia. And there are two other relevant lines of research. People who study prosopagnosia, difficulty recognizing faces, have noticed that the people they were studying appeared to have rather weak imagery, and by contrast, people studying synesthesia, so this is the merging of the senses, where, for example, you might see the letters of the alphabet in color, they tended to have rather vivid imagery. I'm going to come back to the aphantasia phenomenon and its converse hyperphantasia, but before I do so, I'm going to tell you a little about a project, interdisciplinary project, which I've been involved in. I'm going to want to read to you a little, so I'll just dig something out of here. So this is a project which involved a group of collaborators from a number of disciplines, a very glamorous group, as you can see from the photo, including an art historian, an artist, a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a postdoc who did a lot of the work here. And if you want to obtain a grant, at least in the UK, you have to really promise the world. So we said, well, first thing we're going to do is review everything that's ever been written about imagery and condense that into a paper. And the grounds for promising to do this was that the history of a subject is the subject. If you're interested in something, you need to know about its history. But we also felt that there had been such a kind of cascade of knowledge about imagery that it would be interesting to look at what had been written in the past, to frame the old in the light of the new, to see whether there were challenges for neuroscience in the older literature and whether there might be some insights. And I'm on slightly dangerous ground here because I'm in a room full of philosophers, but as we read, it seemed to us that the people we were reading fell into two football teams. There were imagery enthusiasts and there were imagery denigrators. Plato was one of the denigrators. Of course, he thought that the world around us is a shadow, and so images are shadows of shadows. The philosopher uses no object of sense but only pure ideas, moving on through ideas to ideas and ending with ideas. Whereas Aristotle writes, the soul in fact never thinks without a phantasma. And Aquinas in the Middle Ages, echoing Aristotle, gives a nice description of what I'm trying to do to you. Everyone can experience within oneself, very characteristic of philosophers, this is the way it is for me, this is the way it is for everyone. Everyone can experience within oneself that when one tries to understand something, one forms certain phantasms for oneself by way of example, in which one examines, as it were, the thing one is striving to understand. And so it is that when we wish to make someone else understand a thing, we propose examples to him through which he can form phantasms for himself in order to understand. David Hume, in the 18th century, seems to be even more of an enthusiast for visual imagery. When I shut my eyes and think of my study, the ideas I form are exact representations of the impressions I felt when I was in my study. Every detail in one is to be found in the other. Moving to the behaviorists, things are very different if you read Watson. And I find this paragraph rather chilling. When a person closes his eyes and says, I see the house where I was born, the trundle bed in my mother's room where I used to sleep, I can even see my mother as she comes to tuck me in, that person is merely dramatizing. The behaviorist finds no proof of imagery in all this. We have put all these things in words long, long ago. Wave bye-bye to your memories of your mother coming in to tuck you up. And Wittgenstein, in a rather similar vein, suppose that someone were to draw while he had an image, or instead of having it, though, were only with his finger in the air, he could be asked, whom does that represent? And his answer would be decisive. It is quite as if he had given a verbal description, and such a description can also simply take the place of the image. And of course, this tension between these two groups of philosophers found its way into debate in psychology in the 1980s, the Imagery Debate, which was essentially a debate between one group of psychologists who argued that mental imagery is essentially at core propositional, no different from verbal thought, whereas the other group argued that mental imagery does give us actually a distinctive medium of representation. And on the one hand, Pilishin was on the propositional side. Imagery relies on representations that, mental images are abstract mental structures, which are essentially conceptual and propositional, whereas Stephen Coslin on the other side of the debate argued imagery relies on representations that depict information, mental imagery relies on actual images. And there was a nice study which showed that the views that psychologists took in this debate depended to some extent on the vividness of their own imagery. So those who had vivid imagery tend to be on Kozlin's side, those who had very dim imagery tended to be on Kirsch's side. We published this review a couple of years ago. So that was strand 1 of our work. Strand 2 was a meta-analysis of functional imaging studies of visualization. And I'll move fairly rapidly through this because this isn't a mainly neuroscientific audience, but just make the point that when you're conducting a meta-analysis of brain imaging studies, you have it seems a good idea because there's very disparate evidence you want to pull together, but on the other hand it's quite difficult because the studies are often different in key ways. So some of these studies invited people to visualize objects, some of them were more spatial, imagine the angle between the hands of a clock, some involved transformations, control conditions differed, they were sometimes involved perception, sometimes rest, sometimes an active task. Eyes might be open or closed, you might have auditory or visual presentation, short-term or long-term retrieval, language might play a big part or not. The item to be imagined might be general or specific. But nevertheless, we pulled together the studies, there were 40 of them, and that gave us quite a large body of information to meta-analyze using a technique, activation likelihood estimate analysis. And my colleague Corford Minlove tried to localize the areas very precisely using an up-to-date cortical map. That's the list of the key areas. I'll just take you through the most salient of them. So here is an area in the superior posterior parietal lobe of the left hemisphere, which seems to play a particularly key role. It's involved in attentional control. Here is the primary visual cortex, so that's interesting. There's been a big debate about whether early visual areas are involved in visualization or not. This meta-analysis suggests that they are. Here is an area which is in fact involved in controlling eye movements, which seems to be consistently activated. Here is an area on the undersurface of the temporal lobe, very close to that area that's involved in recognizing faces. And then there are some areas in the prefrontal cortex, which are involved in executive control. So what you see is a distributed network of areas, as you would expect, would be required to subserve any complex psychological function like visualization. And then the third strand of our work brings us back to the aphantasia-hyperphantasia distinction. So, it turns out that coining a new term is a really good thing to do if you want to get some publicity for your work. And this was really unexpected, this wasn't the reason for coining the term, but people loved aphantasia, it turned out, so we got a lot of publicity. And since 2015, I've had about 14,000 emails, mostly from people saying that they lack a mind's eye, some from people at the other end of the spectrum. And we have tried, with the help of a lot of student volunteers who've been really an enormous help, to respond to everyone, sending them a VDIQ and our kind of common sense imagery questionnaire. And I'll just take you through the main features of the response. And when I first made the slides for this talk, it was very impressionistic. We actually have some data, so I'll kind of interleave the impressionistic account with the data. So the first rewarding result was that people with aphantasia in particular were very, very pleased about this naming of the phenomenon. They said, I really have for a long time been trying to get across to other people that I'm different in this way, and I generally haven't got it. So it's great to have a term to use to describe it, and that some attention is being paid to it. Then the link with face recognition turned out held up. I don't know how good you'll be at picking out the famous face from in each of these cases, but it seems that, at least at the subjective level, that people with aphantasia do indeed have trouble. So this is the proportion of people with aphantasia describing difficulty with face recognition, as opposed to control people with hyperphantasia at the high end of the spectrum, and control participants in the middle of the spectrum. So an interesting avenue to explore there. A substantial proportion of people with aphantasia describe poor autobiographical memory, and at about the time that we described aphantasia, a memory scientist in Canada described the severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome, which I'll just tell you a little about. And to put it in context, this was named by contrast with the highly superior autobiographical memory syndrome, which you may know about. So there is a group of people who, if you ask them about any date in their personal past, can tell you a good deal of detail. They tend to have a rather obsessional interest in their own past. In other respects, their memory is not particularly remarkable, and they may have somewhat unusual brains. And in that background, this severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome is described. These are people who are normal in most respects, but really are very poor at remembering autobiographical episodes. They have somewhat impaired visual memory on standard tests, and again, there are some putative neural correlates. Now, the areas engaged by autobiographical memory include visual cortices, so perhaps it's not a great surprise that aphantasia should be associated with some autobiographical memory impairment. Here you see that report of bad autobiographical memory is quite common among those with aphantasia, whereas by contrast, the hyperphantasics are reporting rather good autobiographical memory more often than controls. We didn't specifically ask about this in our questionnaire because we thought it might be intrusive, but one of our participants with aphantasia have told us that they're on the autistic spectrum. Not a huge surprise given that autism is classically associated with a deficit of imagination. Many of those with aphantasia, and I still read 1 or 2 mails like this a day, say, you know, novels, I really don't get them. The figures in this boat were those of a strong man with ragged grizzled hair and a sunburned face and a dark girl of 19 or 20, sufficiently likely to be recognizable as his daughter. The girl rowed, pulling a pair of sculls very easily. Reading a passage like that, many of us will begin to form a kind of hazy image. If you don't have any imagery at all, you can see that it might leave you cold. One of the first people to contact us after we coined the term was Craig Venter, the first person to describe the human genome. He attributed his scientific prowess to the absence of visual imagery. He thought that because his head's not cluttered with imagery, he can get on with the real stuff. We have, interestingly, found that if you have aphantasia, that there is a roughly 10-fold increase in the chance that a first-degree relative will. So a hint of some genetics. The great majority of people who come in touch have lifelong aphantasia, but there is a group who have acquired aphantasia, and this is sometimes neurogenic. So we're beginning to try and place these cases into the groups that Martha Farah distinguished and perhaps update her model. This was a kind of curious case, a woman who woke up in the Czech Republic and realized she could no longer visualize. I don't know how she realized this. I think she's probably one of those people who uses imagery to get to sleep. Anyhow, she was perturbed by this. She went to her computer, Googled loss of imagery, found aphantasia, drove to the local emergency room, said I have acute aphantasia and I need a scan, and she had an acute small deep parietal infarct. There are also undoubtedly psychogenic causes of aphantasia, so depression, depersonalization are associated with dimming of imagery, and I'm beginning to see what I think is functional aphantasia, so people who kind of talk themselves into believing that they have aphantasia. We began with the assumption that if you have aphantasia, you probably aren't very interested in the visual world. And we have some data that might look as if it supports that view. So amongst our aphantasic participants, 26% work in broadly scientific or mathematical trades, as against 13% of the aphantasics, and vice versa for creative trades. But, and this was a really nice way to get a big surprise from the work you're doing, a whole series of aphantasic artists got in touch who said, I've always known I'm different. At art school, I realized that other people had lots going on in their mind's eye. I have nothing, and nevertheless I love the visual world, and I make my living by depicting it. So that's a carpet by an aphantasic artist, a sculpture, a painting. And we were sufficiently intrigued by this to mount an exhibition earlier this year of aphantasic and hyperphantasic art. And although these artists, according to their imagery, give very different descriptions of their process, I think you'd be very hard put to tell which of these works are by aphantasic and which by hyperphantasic artists. Contain the imagery if you like. The dreaming wakeful distinction held up. So about 50% of the aphantasic folks say they have dream imagery, 50% don't. 50% don't give interesting descriptions of a visual dream. This may seem really strange until you realize that the neurochemical state of the brain in dreaming is very different to the state in wakefulness. So it actually makes sense to me that these two things could dissociate. The regional activation of the brain is very different. And similarly, the distinction between those who have no imagery in any sense modality and those who only lack visual imagery held up. So Oliver Sacks got in touch. He was aphantasic and prosopagnosic as it happens, but he had reasonably good auditory imagery, whereas Blake Ross, who was the creator of Firefox Mozilla, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, who wrote a very entertaining Facebook post about aphantasia, says he has no sensory imagery of any kind. Finally, at the hyperphantasic end of the spectrum, there does seem to be an association with synesthesia. This is a rather small sample, but you see that an excess of hyperphantasic participants are claiming synesthesia by comparison with controls in the aphantasic participants. Now you might say there seems to be so much variability in aphantasia that you wonder whether it is a real phenomenon at all. I think you would predict this. If it is a disturbance of a complex distributed system, you'd expect it to be able to break down in more than one way. Okay, I'm almost done, but I'll just briefly introduce you to some data that we've really just got in from a pilot study looking at neuropsychology and brain imaging in 20 aphantasic, 24 aphantasic, 25 hyperphantasic, and 20 control participants with average imagery. And we kind of focused on the areas which looked as if they might be of interest from the questionnaire study. So prosopagnosia index it's again subjective, but it's regarded as a reasonably well-validated means of diagnosing prosopagnosia, I understand. And clearly there is an elevated score in the aphantasics by comparison with controls and hyperphantasics. We didn't see any difference in the famous face recognition test, but it was too easy. Everyone was performing at ceiling. There was a small difference in a graded buildings test where people have to recognize increasingly obscure buildings with the advantage in the hyperphantasic group. So some support for the idea that there may be a face recognition problem associated with aphantasia. Rather stronger support for the link with autobiographical memory difficulty. So these data come from a test in which you ask people to pick out a couple of episodes from their past lives and you press them to give you as much detail as they can about the events they're describing. And you see that aphantasics are markedly impaired by comparison with hyperphantasics. These are two other different ways of scoring the same material, essentially. Both are looking at the episodic richness of the memories, whereas this is looking at incidental semantic information, so you wouldn't predict any difference there. Similar results when you ask people to describe atemporal or temporal events, so essentially to imagine events. The hyperphantasics provide much more detail than the aphantasics. And our brain imaging, again, we're at a rather early stage of analysis, but I can tell you that there were no major structural differences between the brains of people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia, which I think I'd expect, because that's a relatively coarse form of analysis. There weren't any major differences in connections, but there is an interesting difference in function imaging. So essentially this is showing you areas which are more active in the brains of hyperphantasic participants than aphantasic participants when they visualize by comparison with perception. So this area in the parietal lobe is quite close to that area which is strongly implicated in the function imaging meta-analysis I showed you before. And then this is an analysis in which you look at the resting brain and ask where there may be differences between groups in connectivity. And if you take as your area of interest the visual cortices and ask whether there are any differences between hyperphantasic and aphantasic brains in the way the visual cortices are connected, it turns out that there are stronger connections in the hyperphantasic group between visual cortices and areas of the frontal lobe. Okay, so how would I reflect on all this? Well, it's clearly been a popular topic, and it's interesting. There are some bits of research which you don't want to mention at a dinner party, because they go nowhere. But people love talking about this, and I think the reason they do is that representing things in their absence is such a kind of fundamental human act, as I mentioned at the start. And it's quite an intimate, emotional act. We often talk about these experiences in with those close to us in rather intimate circumstances. And for most of us, when we are representing the past, for example, visualization is a key component. It's a saving component. And I think we're intrigued to discover this invisible difference. The 2% of those with aphantasia are glad that some attention is being paid, the rest of us are intrigued. Aristotle was wrong. The soul can think without a phantasm. And this work points, I think, to a distinction between visualization and imagination. So you clearly can be highly imaginative without being able to visualize. Our participant sample includes aphantasic novelists, aphantasic scientists, aphantasic artists. Imagination is a much broader capacity than visualization. So to recap, I have introduced you to a patient who lost the ability to visualize and who appeared to be unable to activate his visual cortices, as most of us can do when we try to visualize. And then that report, the report of his case led to the rediscovery that a couple of % of the population probably lack the minds of congenital aphantasia. I suggested that variations in imagery vividness may have had some impact in thinking, philosophical and psychological thinking historically about imagery. I've introduced you to the idea that there is an imagery network within the visualizing brain. So I thought I wouldn't have enough time. I removed a small part of the talk about the neural correlates of visual imagery vividness, which we can come back to if you like. And then finally, I hope I've persuaded you that aphantasia and hyperphantasia are an interesting psychological phenomenon with some intriguing association. So this work started in Edinburgh with my colleagues Sergio Della Sala and Michaela Duro, moved to Exeter, involved the Zeman group and my collaborators in Exeter, Fraser Milton and John Fulford, and then it really wouldn't have been possible without Britt and James and Mada and Keelan and Zoe and a number of other student interns who I haven't mentioned here. And then Rory came along, who's been very helpful with this research. And here's our website if you want to learn more. Thanks very much.
So, thank you for that excellent talk. And I am not a philosopher, but a neuroscientist, so this may change a little bit direction in a normal discussion session. But one of the things that seems to me from your talk is you're kind of dissociating imagination from visual imagery. And there may be different networks for this. But so one of the kind of questions I have, or thoughts I had, was, have you, or is there data about olfactory imagery, auditory imagery, or do these aphantasic patients show increases in abilities for other sensory systems, as well as the fact that if, as a primate, a large portion of our brain is devoted to visual processes. So if this is the case, would say a rodent that has olfactory, more areas devoted to olfaction, possibly be able to display things like visual, olfactory imagery? Do you think it's possible in the animal brain?
Would it be helpful to answer that before you go on?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay? Because I never forget.
No.
So I think that would be the really interesting questions. So first point is a kind of pernickety one, which is that we're trying to avoid the terms patient, diagnosis and condition, because I think for most of these folk aren't patients, they're totally normal people who just have this variation in their psychological makeup. So it's more like having synesthesia than it is like having a disorder. There is work on imagery and other sense modalities, and essentially the kind of neurobiology seems to be similar, that you use the relevant sensory cortex to represent the information that you're imagining. I think there's a really interesting question to explore as to whether people with aphantasia lack imagery across the board, or just like imagery among sense modalities. Certainly subjective testimony, aesthetics, variable, and people are very articulate about this. So there are some people who say, look, I can hear a symphony in my mind's ear. I'm really good at auditory imagery, but I don't have any visual imagery. And there are other people who say, I can't do any of it. And my initial inclination is to believe them and think that there's probably variability here, and there are both some generic factors and some modality-specific factors.
And I have actually one last follow-up. So you see significant activation in amygdala, which is an emotional structure related to emotion. So what kind of factors would emotion be playing in this imagery process or imagination process?
Okay, so again, a nice question. So that was in Alamedishai's work. I think you'd see more amygdala activation if you were imagining something frightening or something stressful than if you were imagining something neutral. I haven't said anything about the kind of emotional dimension of aphantasia and aphantasia, or I've said very little. And I think they're really interesting too. So, there's a lot of evidence that imagery can drive emotion, drive cravings, involve addiction. So maybe if you're aphantasic, you're a little bit protected from some of those problems. Maybe you're less likely to develop PTSD. If you're aphantasic, you may be more at risk. So I think if you're aphantasic, maybe you can be more present. A lot of people with aphantasia have said, I move on quite easily. So I think there's an interesting set of emotional associations to explore.
Thank you very much. So now